The desert stretched wide and endless, a canvas of ochre sand and jagged rock painted beneath the relentless sun. Heat shimmered on the horizon, distorting the distance, making mountains dance like ghosts. A single rider cut across this barren landscape, his horse moving at a steady, unhurried pace. The man sat tall in the saddle, though his shoulders sagged with weariness. His name was Daniel Hayes, a rancher by trade, though some would still whisper soldier behind his back, remembering the war that had carved years off his life and left shadows in his eyes. Daniel had no family to speak of anymore. The war had taken his brother. Fever had claimed his wife. His small ranch, little more than a modest spread on the fringes of Apache land, was all he had left to show for decades of labor and pain. The bank pressed him every season, and neighbors shook their heads, muttering that Hayes ought to sell before drought or raiders finished him off. But Daniel was stubborn. He'd sooner starve than surrender what his hands had built. The silence of the desert was something he both loved and loathed. It soothed him, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats against packed sand, the creak of saddle leather. But in that silence came the memories: gunpowder smoke, men screaming, the cries of the dying. He often wondered if he was riding to something or away from it all. That morning, the sun already high, Daniel shifted in his saddle and scanned the horizon. He was returning from trading cattle in a distant town, saddlebags lightened by debt payments. His rifle rested in its scabbard, though his hand often strayed near it out of old habit. Out here, you didn't ride unprepared. The land was as dangerous as it was beautiful: coyotes, bandits, and sometimes desperate men with nothing to lose. Despite the hardness in him, Daniel wasn't cruel. He'd offered water to travelers, even shared food with drifters when he had little himself. Yet he kept his distance. Bonds led to heartbreak, and he'd endured enough of that to last a lifetime. As he rode, a hawk circled overhead, its cries sharp against the still air. The horse shifted uneasily, as if sensing what Daniel could not yet see. He reined in, narrowing his eyes toward the canyon ahead, a narrow pass cutting through rust-colored stone. It was the quickest way home, but also the most dangerous. Many a man had vanished in those winding shadows, victims of ambush or accident. Still he pressed forward. Time was something he couldn't spare. The canyon walls rose high, blotting out the horizon, trapping the rider in a labyrinth of stone. Shadows cooled the air, but unease prickled at the back of Daniel's neck. He adjusted his hat and urged his horse on, every sense alert. A man didn't survive long in these parts without trusting his instincts. And then, faint but undeniable, the sound came. Gunfire, echoing between the rocks. His pulse quickened, his grip tightening on the reins. Outlaws, perhaps, or a skirmish between soldiers and Apache. Either way, it wasn't his business. A wise man would turn back, find another path, let strangers fight their battles. But Daniel Hayes wasn't always a wise man. He stopped his horse and listened again. The sharp, desperate cry of a woman carried on the wind, thin but piercing, the kind of sound that made a man's blood run hot with urgency. Daniel cursed under his breath. He knew he should ride away, but something inside him, some stubborn, unshakable core of decency, would not let him ignore it. The lone rider spurred his horse forward, toward the danger, toward the unknown, and toward the moment that would change his life forever. The canyon narrowed the deeper Daniel rode, its walls pressing in like the jaws of a beast waiting to snap shut. Sunlight trickled down in slanted beams, broken by jagged rock ledges overhead. His horse's hooves clattered against stone, each sound magnified tenfold by the echoing walls. Daniel's hand hovered close to the rifle at his side, his jaw clenched tight. He knew the signs. This was a killing ground, the perfect place for an ambush. The gunfire came again, louder this time, ringing sharp and frantic. Daniel pulled up, listening, trying to mark its direction. Then came the sounds of shouting, men's voices rough with malice, their words indistinguishable but their tone unmistakable. And over them, piercing through the chaos, the cry of a woman. Desperate, defiant. Daniel kicked his horse forward, the animal reluctant but obedient, driven by the urgency in its rider's voice. They rounded a bend, and the scene exploded before him. Down below, at the canyon's base, a group of bandits had cornered several Apache hunters. The air was thick with dust and smoke, arrows and bullets flying in both directions. But Daniel's eyes fixed on one figure, a young woman, her long, dark hair matted with sweat, standing against the canyon wall. She was wounded, her bow clutched loosely in her hand, arrows scattered at her feet. Two of the outlaws advanced on her, pistols raised, laughter echoing cruelly off the rock. Something ignited in Daniel then. He didn't think. He didn't weigh the risks. His hand moved on instinct, pulling the rifle free in one smooth motion. The crack of the shot split the air, sending one bandit sprawling. Before the others could react, Daniel had fired again, striking the second. The canyon erupted in confusion. The bandits, startled by the unexpected intrusion, turned their fire toward the ridge where Daniel sat astride his horse. Bullets sparked off stone around him, but Daniel remained steady, his rifle barking with deadly precision. Years of soldiering had drilled into him the cold focus of battle. Breath steady, aim true, no wasted motion. The Apache hunters, seeing their chance, surged forward with renewed fury. Their arrows flew swift and sure, finding gaps in the bandits' defenses. Cries of pain rang out, men fell, and the tide shifted. What moments before had seemed certain slaughter now turned into a rout. But Daniel's gaze kept returning to the young woman. She had collapsed against the canyon wall, her bow slipping from her grasp. Even from a distance, he could see the blood staining her shoulder, the pallor creeping into her face. She fought to stay upright, but her body was failing. "Hold on," Daniel muttered under his breath, as if she could hear him through the chaos. He urged his horse down the slope, weaving between fallen men, dust stinging his eyes. The battle still raged, but in that instant, all he saw was her. Reaching her side, he leapt from the saddle. The woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with both fear and fierce defiance. She tried to push him away, weakly raising her hand as if to ward off another enemy. But Daniel's voice was firm, low, the voice of a man who'd seen death too many times to mistake its nearness. "Easy now. I've got you," she hesitated, her gaze searching his face. Something in his tone, or perhaps the simple fact that he had turned his rifle not on her, but on her attackers, stilled her resistance. Her hand fell, and her body slumped forward, fainting into his arms. Gunfire still echoed through the canyon, but Daniel no longer cared. With the woman limp against his chest, he knew he had stepped across a line. This was no longer about strangers' battles or debts owed to no one. He had made a choice, and choices, he knew, always carried consequences. As he lifted her onto his horse and swung up behind, the canyon walls seemed to close tighter around him. The bandits might scatter, the Apaches might live another day, but Daniel Hayes's life had just veered onto a path he could neither foresee nor escape. The desert sun dipped lower, painting the canyon walls in fiery shades of orange and red, but Daniel paid it little mind. His focus remained entirely on the woman slumped against him on horseback. Each shallow breath she drew tugged at his chest, a painful reminder that her life hung in fragile balance. Her dark hair clung to her sweat-streaked face, framing high cheekbones and eyes that even half-closed seemed alive with fire. She was unlike anyone Daniel had ever seen, both delicate and unbroken, a fierce spirit trapped in a weakened body. Every jolt of the horse sent a pang of pain through her arm, freshly grazed by a bullet, and Daniel winced with each movement. He adjusted her gently, careful not to disturb the wound, and murmured soft reassurances he didn't know if she could understand. "Easy now. Just hold on. We're almost out." He knew he was bluffing. He didn't know where out truly was. The nearest settlement was hours away, across desert flats and dangerous terrain. But he would find shelter, whatever it took. Her eyes fluttered open at one point, dark and wide with confusion. She tried to push herself upright, but her strength betrayed her. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the creak of leather and the distant echo of gunfire fading behind them. "Daniel Hayes," he replied, keeping his voice calm and steady. "I saved you back there." She blinked as if testing the sound of his words against reality. Suspicion flashed across her features. She tried to sit up straighter again, a futile attempt that only caused her body to tremble. Daniel gently pressed a hand against her shoulder to steady her. "I've got you," he repeated. "You're safe now?" For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of hooves against rock. Her breathing was uneven, and Daniel could see the tension in every line of her body. He realized that while her body was injured, her spirit had not been broken. She was a fighter through and through. He could sense it in the way she tried, again and again, to assert control despite her weakness. As the canyon widened into a more open plateau, Daniel spied the ruins of an old mission ahead. It was dilapidated, the roof long gone, walls cracked and crumbling, but it offered shelter. He guided the horse carefully into the enclosure, easing her down with tenderness born from desperation and instinct. She collapsed against the rubble, wincing as he examined the wound on her shoulder. The bullet had grazed her, leaving a shallow but bloody gash that would fester without attention. Daniel tore strips from his shirt to create a makeshift bandage, his fingers deft and practiced, though they shook slightly under the strain of keeping her calm. She flinched at every touch but didn't resist. There was a silent acknowledgement in her eyes, a recognition that she owed her life, at least for now, to this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. Night fell quickly in the desert, bringing a chill that seeped into bones and stone alike. Daniel built a small fire, both for warmth and protection, keeping his rifle within reach. The woman sat beside it, her movements slow and deliberate, as if every gesture cost her effort. She spoke little, only occasionally murmuring words in Apache, her voice soft and musical despite the pain. Though he couldn't understand, Daniel listened closely, fascinated by the cadence and tone, the life behind the unfamiliar words. By the time the fire burned low, a fragile trust had begun to form between them. She no longer recoiled at his touch, and he no longer feared every movement would harm her. In that quiet, under a sky brimming with stars, Daniel realized that saving her had changed him as much as it had saved her. Something indefinable had shifted, a bond formed not by words, but by necessity and instinct. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a flicker of something beyond survival. And in the depth of the night, with the desert still and endless around them, both the wounded woman and the lone rider would come to understand that their fates were now entwined, though neither yet knew how tightly. The ruins of the old mission stood in solemn silence, a skeleton of a building that had once been alive with life and devotion. Daniel led his horse through the broken archway, the sound of hoofbeats echoing against the crumbling walls. The sun was sinking, casting long shadows that stretched across the sand-strewn floor. It wasn't much, but it would serve. Here, at least, they could rest without fear of wandering bandits, and the walls offered some protection against the chill that would creep in with nightfall. He gently lifted the woman from the horse, her weight a mixture of fragility and stubborn strength. She winced, her body protesting every motion, yet her gaze remained alert, scanning the ruin with cautious suspicion. Daniel understood. She was a warrior, a hunter, a member of a people who had survived countless hardships. Her mistrust was not an insult, it was survival instinct. "Stay here," he said softly, laying her on a pile of worn blankets he had managed to gather. "I'll get water and make a fire." She said nothing, merely nodded, her eyes flicking toward him with quiet calculation. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the coiled readiness that came from a life spent on alert. Yet she made no move to escape. Daniel scavenged what he could from the ruins, a few broken roof beams, some dry wood hidden under rubble, even remnants of a shallow stone basin he could fill with water from a small nearby stream. As the fire caught and crackled, sending sparks into the cool evening air, he glanced at her. She was sitting upright now, leaning slightly against the wall, arms wrapped around herself. Her wounds had been crudely bandaged, but the pain was evident in her furrowed brow and the way she shifted with every movement. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, hesitant to push too far. She hesitated, then finally spoke. "Nayeli," she said, her voice low, careful, measured. "Nayeli, Daniel," he replied, nodding. "We'll keep it that way for now. You're safe here. She didn't respond, but her eyes softened ever so slightly. The tension in her body eased, just a fraction, as if acknowledging that the man before her had saved her from more than just the bandits. He had preserved a part of her life she hadn't been sure she would see again. Night deepened, and the temperature dropped sharply. Daniel stoked the fire, the flickering flames reflecting in Nayeli's dark eyes. There was a quiet understanding in that shared silence. He could sense her studying him, just as he studied her, each trying to gauge whether the other posed a threat or offered a fragile alliance. She didn't speak much, but in her eyes Daniel read resilience and intelligence. She was not a helpless damsel. She was a survivor, a fighter, a person shaped by a harsh world. As the stars began to pierce the dark sky, Daniel realized that his responsibility was more than just tending her wounds. He had to ensure she could trust him, if even a little. Every move, every gesture mattered. He offered her water, helped her adjust the blanket, and kept his rifle close but unobtrusive. Gradually, she allowed him near, permitting small acts of care without pulling away. Trust, he knew, would take time, but it had begun. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, Daniel had crafted a small sense of safety for them both. Nayeli's breathing had slowed, her posture less rigid, and there was an unspoken acknowledgement between them. They had survived the night together, and in this fragile partnership, something new had begun. In the quiet desert, under the shelter of ancient stones, two people from different worlds had found a shared moment of peace, and though neither could know it yet, that night would mark the beginning of a bond forged in survival, courage, and the unspoken understanding that their fates were now intertwined. The night in the ruined mission offered a fragile sense of safety, but Daniel knew it wouldn't last. The desert was vast, but it was also unforgiving, and news of the bandits' failure would travel fast. They would come looking for revenge, and Daniel, as the man who had intervened, was now marked in their eyes. The first signs came at dawn. A hawk circled overhead, its sharp cry cutting through the morning stillness. Daniel noticed the faint movement of dust clouds in the distance, just beyond the ridge, a telltale sign of riders approaching. His instincts, honed by years of warfare and frontier survival, flared immediately. He didn't speak at first. Words would only betray their position. Instead, he gestured for Nayeli to stay low, her bandaged arm still weak from the wound. "You'll have to trust me," he whispered, his voice firm but gentle. She nodded, gripping the blanket she held against her chest. There was no fear in her eyes, only focus, the quiet fire of a trained hunter preparing to fight. Though Daniel had saved her life, it was clear she had no intention of being a passive victim. They moved carefully, keeping to the shadows and using the terrain to their advantage. Daniel's plan was simple: avoid direct confrontation if possible, buy time for Nayeli to recover, and ensure they weren't caught in a trap. But as they rounded a bend in the canyon, their worst fears became real. The bandits were not just in pursuit. They had split into a line, cutting off their path forward, their horses snorting, weapons ready. Daniel's heart tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. Panic would only cost them both their lives. "Stay behind me," he instructed, raising his rifle. Nayeli obeyed without hesitation, moving silently, her eyes scanning the bandits for weakness. The bandits charged, reckless with anger and underestimating the pair before them. Daniel's rifle barked, one shot felling a horse and unbalancing its rider. Nayeli, recovering some strength, surprised him by pulling an arrow from her quiver and letting it fly with unerring accuracy, striking one of the bandits squarely. He realized then that her strength wasn't just in survival. It was skill, honed by a life in the wild. The skirmish escalated. Daniel moved with deadly precision, forcing the bandits to hesitate and giving Nayeli moments to retreat behind rocks and debris. Dust and gun smoke filled the air, burning in their eyes, but neither faltered. Daniel could feel the rhythm of battle in his bones, the silent coordination between him and Nayeli forming without words. Each instinctive movement protected them both, each shot and arrow creating a fragile bubble of safety amid chaos. Finally, the remaining bandits, seeing their losses and the relentless skill of the two, faltered. The desert's vastness worked against them as much as against Daniel and Naeli. With a final warning shot, Daniel sent them retreating, the riders scattering across the rocky landscape. Silence fell once more, heavy and tense, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. Daniel lowered his rifle, his muscles aching from tension, and turned to Naeli. She was leaning against a boulder, pale but proud, a faint smile brushing her lips despite the danger. "You're stronger than I thought," he said, a note of admiration in his voice. She didn't respond immediately, only letting her eyes meet his for a brief, wordless acknowledgement. In that moment, something shifted. They were no longer just rescuer and rescued. The battle had forged a bond, one of mutual reliance, respect, and recognition of each other's strength. Daniel realized that saving her life was only the beginning. Surviving together, facing danger side by side, would begin to weave the threads of trust and perhaps even something deeper, something neither had yet named. The desert, vast and unforgiving, seemed a little smaller now, and as they continued their journey, both Daniel and Naeli understood that the path ahead would demand courage, cunning, and cooperation in equal measure. After days of careful travel through the harsh, sun-baked desert, Daniel guided Naeli toward the edge of the Apache territory. The journey had been grueling, each day testing their endurance and cooperation. Naeli's strength was slowly returning, though the scar on her shoulder reminded both of them that danger had not fully passed. They moved cautiously, aware that while the bandits were no longer in immediate pursuit, the land was still fraught with perils. Yet in the quiet moments, Daniel had come to appreciate the depth of Naeli's spirit. Her resilience was inspiring, her courage unwavering. As the familiar red and brown hues of the plains began to shift into the green brush and low hills of her village, Naeli's posture changed. Her shoulders straightened, and her gaze sharpened, scanning the horizon with a hunter's intuition. Daniel noticed her alertness. She was returning not just to safety, but to a world of family, traditions, and responsibilities that he, as an outsider, could barely comprehend. The closer they came, the more he realized how little he knew of her people and their customs. The village appeared suddenly, tucked between the hills and the river, a cluster of adobe homes and teepees with smoke curling from small hearths. Children ran along the paths, and elders watched from shaded doorways, their eyes narrowing as they noticed the approaching pair. Daniel slowed his horse, giving Naeli the space to move forward. It was her world now, and he was a stranger crossing its boundaries. Naeli dismounted and stepped lightly to the ground, her movements precise and controlled, despite the lingering pain in her shoulder. She did not rush to greet the elders or her family. Instead, she took a moment to center herself, standing tall and proud, her dark eyes meeting the curious and cautious gazes of her people. Daniel followed at a respectful distance, aware that his presence could be seen as intrusive or even threatening. A small group of villagers approached, led by an older man whose lined face carried authority and wisdom. He stopped just short of Naeli, his gaze assessing Daniel with quiet suspicion. Daniel lowered his hat, offering a gesture of respect he hoped transcended language and custom. Naeli's voice rose then, steady and clear, as she explained briefly in her native tongue what had happened, the ambush, the bandits, and how Daniel had saved her life. The elders listened carefully, exchanging solemn glances. Their eyes, sharp and discerning, were not easily swayed by words alone. They weighed Daniel's actions against their customs, the traditions that had guided their people for generations. Finally, after a long moment of silence, the eldest spoke. His tone was measured, carrying both authority and gravity. By saving Naeli's life, he declared, Daniel had fulfilled a sacred duty, one that bound him to her according to Apache tradition. Daniel's heart sank. He had never sought this responsibility, never imagined that an act of survival and instinct could carry such weight. Naeli, too, tensed, her hands clenching at her sides. She had survived countless dangers, yet now she faced a new challenge, one of obligation, culture, and unchosen ties. Neither of them had anticipated that returning her to her people would come with such profound implications. As the sun dipped low, Casting long shadows across the village, Daniel realized that the desert trials had only been the beginning. This return to her people introduced a new kind of challenge, one that required respect, understanding, and negotiation with forces far beyond the simple struggle for survival. In the quiet of the evening, amidst the whispering wind and the watchful eyes of the villagers, Daniel understood that the bond forged in the canyon would be tested in ways he had never imagined. And Nayeli, standing proud yet wary beside him, knew the journey forward would demand courage not just of the body, but of the heart and spirit. The evening air in the Apache village was filled with quiet anticipation. Smoke from small hearth fires curled into the sky, mingling with the fading hues of sunset, and the entire community seemed to gather in a subtle but deliberate pattern. The elders, seated in a semicircle atop a low rise overlooking the village, observed the proceedings with unwavering focus. Daniel stood at a distance, his jaw tight and posture rigid, aware that he was being judged, not merely as an outsider, but as a man whose actions had carried profound consequences. Nayeli, though injured and weary from their journey, stood tall beside him, her expression guarded but resolute. The eldest of the council, a man named Takoda, rose slowly. His face was lined with age, his eyes sharp and unyielding, carrying the weight of tradition and authority. He addressed both Daniel and Nayeli in measured tones, explaining the sacred custom that governed their people. "When a life is saved," he said, "the spirits demand acknowledgement. The one who saves and the one saved are bound by sacred law. This is not merely ceremony, it is a covenant of honor and responsibility." Daniel listened, his mind racing. He had acted instinctively, out of necessity, and yet here he was, being made accountable to a tradition he scarcely understood. He opened his mouth to protest, but Nayeli placed a hand on his arm, a silent warning. She had been raised to respect the elders, to honor the law of her people, and she knew that resistance would only complicate matters. Takoda continued, turning his gaze toward Nayeli. "By surviving the ambush through the courage and skill of this man, your life has been claimed in the eyes of our ancestors. He is now connected to you, not as a stranger, but as one who carries a sacred duty toward you. You must honor this bond even if it is unfamiliar or unexpected." The words hung in the air, heavy with expectation. Nayeli's eyes met Daniel's, a complex mixture of defiance, curiosity, and acknowledgement reflected in their depths. Daniel felt a surge of conflict. He had never sought such responsibility. He had saved her life out of instinct, not obligation. Yet the weight of this tradition was real, binding, and not easily dismissed. Here, in this moment, he was confronted with a choice between personal freedom and adherence to a culture he had only begun to glimpse. The elders watched him closely, their expressions unreadable. Daniel could feel their scrutiny like the desert sun, penetrating and relentless. He understood that the decision he made now would shape not only his life but Nayeli's as well. To reject the custom would be seen as dishonor, an affront to the spirits and to the tribe. To accept it, however, was to enter a world of responsibilities and expectations he had never imagined. Nayeli, though silent, communicated volumes through her posture and gaze. She did not demand, she did not plead, she simply stood, an equal participant in the ritual of choice. Daniel realized that the bond being declared was not one-sided. It required both consent and commitment, though framed within the parameters of a culture far different from his own. Takoda concluded the ceremony with a solemn declaration, affirming that Daniel's act of bravery had created a bond sanctioned by the spirits and witnessed by the entire village. The sacred law had spoken, and the weight of it pressed heavily on the young rancher's shoulders. He felt the enormity of the moment, realizing that heroism had consequences beyond the battlefield, beyond survival. It had the power to reshape lives and destinies. As night fully descended, with stars twinkling over the desert hills, Daniel and Nayeli were left alone briefly at the edge of the gathering. The air was thick with unspoken questions and the enormity of change. In the quiet, Daniel understood that this sacred tradition was more than ritual. It was a test of character, endurance, and heart. Naeli, once merely the woman he had rescued, was now a force of destiny, bound to him by law, culture, and circumstance. In the vast, ancient desert, two worlds had collided, frontier and tribe, survival and tradition, and neither would ever be the same. The days following the sacred declaration were tense, suffused with an invisible friction that neither Daniel nor Naeli could easily resolve. The villagers returned to their routines, yet the bond recognized by their elders hung over the pair like a shadow, unspoken but unrelenting. Daniel, who had always valued independence and self-reliance, found himself constrained in ways that unsettled him. Naeli, proud and fiercely autonomous, resisted the notion of being claimed, despite the legal and spiritual weight of the tribal decree. Their worlds were colliding, and the collision sparked sparks of conflict that neither could ignore. The first morning after the ceremony, Daniel tried to speak to her, choosing his words carefully. "Naeli," he began, keeping his voice low and measured, I never asked for this. I saved your life, yes, but I didn't sign up for—" He trailed off, unsure how to phrase the unthinkable, that he could be legally and spiritually bound to a stranger. Naeli's eyes flashed, her hand gripping the edge of the blanket she had carried since the canyon. "Daniel," she said firmly, her voice steady, "I know your actions saved me, but that does not mean my life belongs to anyone. Not to you, not to the spirits, not to anyone." Her words were sharp, deliberate, yet carried an undercurrent of the respect she felt for the elder's judgment. She was asserting herself, making it clear that her own will had not been extinguished by the decree. Daniel felt a surge of frustration and helplessness. He had faced bandits, bullets, and the harsh desert, yet nothing had challenged him like this. This was not a fight he could win with skill or firepower. It was a test of patience, understanding, and diplomacy. "I'm not trying to claim you," he said, struggling to articulate his intent. "I'm just trying to figure out what this means for both of us." Naeli's gaze softened slightly, but her posture remained rigid, her pride unyielding. "It means," she said slowly, "that we must live with this bond. But it does not erase who I am. I will not be told how to feel or forced into a life I did not choose. I survived your bullets, Daniel, but I will not survive losing my freedom." For the first time, Daniel understood the weight of her perspective. To her, the sacred bond was not simply a tradition. It was a responsibility that came with expectations he could not impose upon her heart or spirit. His own feelings, complicated as they were, could not override her autonomy. They were equals in this strange arrangement, bound by circumstance and custom, yet each fiercely protective of personal agency. The clash of wills manifested in small ways, in disagreements over daily routines, in subtle acts of independence Naeli insisted upon, in Daniel's cautious attempts to assert guidance without overstepping. Yet, paradoxically, it also created a space for mutual respect. Each recognized the other's strength, the courage it took to maintain autonomy under pressure, and the resilience necessary to survive not just the desert, but the expectations of a culture neither fully belonged to. By the time evening fell, both were exhausted, not from physical labor, but from the emotional battle waged in silence and glances, in words chosen carefully and silences held firmly. They sat near the fire, the crackling flames between them, and for the first time allowed a tentative acknowledgement of shared purpose. They did not yet trust each other fully, nor did they yet admit the stirrings of respect and perhaps something more, but they understood that if they were to survive both the desert and the sacred bond, they would have to navigate the collision of wills with patience, tact, and ultimately cooperation. In that quiet night, under the watchful gaze of stars that had seen countless generations rise and fall, Daniel and Naeli realized that their journey had shifted. It was no longer merely about survival, it was about learning to coexist, to honor tradition and individuality simultaneously, and to confront the challenges of heart and spirit as fiercely as they had once confronted gunfire in the canyon. The days that followed the clash of wills were quieter, but no less intense. The physical danger of the desert had passed, yet Daniel and Naeli found themselves navigating a more complicated terrain. the uncharted landscape of trust, understanding, and unspoken emotion. They were bound by a sacred tradition neither had chosen, yet their survival together had forged a connection deeper than circumstance alone. Now the challenge lay in reconciling two very different worlds, the frontier life Daniel knew and the rich, intricate customs that governed Nayeli's Apache community. Morning light spilled over the village, illuminating the adobe walls and the rolling hills beyond. Daniel woke before the sun, as was his habit, moving with quiet efficiency to tend to tasks, gathering water, checking weapons, ensuring the perimeter was safe. Nayeli followed soon after, moving with careful deliberation, her arms still tender but her resolve intact. She had spent her life learning to adapt, to read the land, and now she found herself observing Daniel with equal attentiveness. They moved through the routines of the day like dancers learning new steps, each watching the other, testing boundaries, and measuring reactions. Their conversations, when they spoke, were cautious but revealing. Daniel asked about her people, her upbringing, the lessons instilled by elders and parents. Nayeli shared what she could, cautious not to divulge sacred knowledge, but willing to offer glimpses of the world she had known since childhood. In return, Daniel recounted fragments of his own life, a childhood on the prairie, the harsh lessons of war, the solitude of a rancher living on the fringes of society. In sharing these details, they began to recognize a shared core, resilience, courage, and the capacity to endure hardship. Trust began to grow in subtle ways. Nayeli allowed Daniel to assist with chores around her village, guiding him with patient instruction rather than outright command. He, in turn, respected her knowledge of the land, following her advice about which areas were safe, which paths were treacherous, and how to read the signs of the desert. This mutual deference created a fragile harmony, a rhythm of cooperation that neither had anticipated. It was not love, at least not yet, but it was something equally significant: recognition of each other's strengths and the willingness to rely on one another. Evenings were the most revealing. After the day's labor, they would sit by the fire, sharing silence and stories, occasionally offering a tentative smile or a fleeting glance. The bond established in the canyon and tempered by danger now deepened in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. Daniel noticed the subtle gestures, the way Nayeli adjusted her blanket without complaint, the way she offered guidance without condescension. Nayeli observed the care Daniel took in small tasks, the way he moved with precision and thoughtfulness, and the quiet determination in his eyes that had carried him through countless trials. Yet the tension remained. The sacred tradition that bound them together was a constant reminder that their worlds were still separate. Daniel could not fully immerse himself in her culture, nor could Nayeli completely abandon her independence. This duality created an unspoken challenge: how to honor the past and the present, the customs of her people, and the freedom he had always known. Each day they navigated this space between worlds, testing patience, forging respect, and laying the foundation for understanding. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, Daniel and Nayeli had come to an unspoken realization. Their connection, though complicated and defined by external forces, was growing into something authentic. They had survived the desert together, faced enemies side by side, and endured the judgment of a community steeped in ancient law. And now, in the quiet between action and tradition, they were learning to survive the more subtle trials of heart and trust. Between two worlds, one of rugged frontier life, the other of ancestral tradition, they had found a fragile equilibrium. It was a beginning, delicate and uncertain, but filled with the promise of something stronger than fear, stronger than duty, the potential for choice, understanding, and perhaps even love. The threat returned like a shadow long thought banished. Word reached the village that a rival band of outlaws, emboldened by the previous failure of their comrades, was planning a raid, not only on Daniel's ranch but on the Apache settlement itself. The tension in the air was palpable. Men sharpened weapons, children were sent to safe spaces, and the elders convened once more. Daniel and Nayeli stood side by side, The bond forged in survival and tested by tradition now about to face its ultimate trial. The pair had grown accustomed to one another over weeks of shared labor, danger, and understanding. Yet nothing in their experiences could prepare them for the immediacy of this new threat. Daniel had always relied on instinct, skill, and grit. Nayeli had relied on knowledge of the land, agility, and ancestral wisdom. Together, they formed a formidable team, each complementing the other's strengths. But now, in the crucible of imminent attack, their trust would be tested like never before. As the first bandits crested the hill, Daniel motioned for Nayeli to take position along the ridge with a clear line of sight. Her movements were fluid, precise, and deadly. Even wounded, she could strike with lethal accuracy. Daniel took a position near the village entrance, rifle ready, eyes scanning the horizon for movement. The attack was swift, chaotic, and brutal. Dust and gunfire clouded the air. Children and elders were ushered into hidden shelters, while the warriors of the tribe, aided by Daniel and Nayeli, met the invaders head-on. The battle pushed both Daniel and Nayeli to the limits of endurance. Daniel moved with calculated precision, every shot deliberate, every step a calculated risk. Nayeli's arrows flew with deadly grace, each one finding its mark. Amid the chaos, they worked without speaking, anticipating each other's actions, the bond formed from survival and mutual respect now operating like instinct. The clash of wills that had defined their early days was replaced by unity, a shared understanding that the lives of many depended on their coordination and courage. When the dust settled and the last of the attackers fled, the village stood bruised but unbroken. The warriors counted the losses, and the elders nodded in solemn approval. Daniel lowered his rifle, his body aching, his mind racing. Nayeli approached him, her movements deliberate, no longer constrained by injury or doubt. For a moment, the silence between them spoke louder than words ever could. "I couldn't have done it without you," Daniel said, his voice low, edged with awe and gratitude. Nayeli's gaze softened, and she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. The tension of the past weeks, the clash of tradition, independence, and duty, began to ease, replaced by recognition of something deeper. They had survived not only the desert and outlaws, but the complexities of their intertwined lives. Later, by the edge of the village under a sky heavy with stars, they spoke freely for the first time. They acknowledged the sacred bond, but also the choice they now shared, to allow it to grow into something more than duty. Love, respect, and understanding had been cultivated in the crucible of survival and tradition. The realization dawned gently, like the first light of dawn breaking across the desert plains. Daniel and Nayeli's hands brushed, tentative at first, then with a quiet certainty. The man who had saved her life, and the woman whose people had bound him through sacred law, now stood not just as protector and protected, but as equals, partners in both duty and heart. Their bond was no longer solely defined by obligation. It was strengthened by choice, courage, and the understanding of each other's strength. In the days that followed, life returned to the village and the surrounding land. Yet Daniel and Nayeli knew that their shared journey had forever changed them. They had navigated danger, tradition, and personal pride, emerging not only unbroken, but bound in a partnership that honored both heritage and personal agency. Where once there had been survival, obligation, and distrust now bloomed trust, respect, and the quiet promise of love, proving that duty and desire could coexist, creating a life stronger than either alone. In the vast desert under endless skies, two souls who had begun as strangers had found harmony between worlds, between law and choice and between hearts, forever intertwined.